Ready? Okay. Cameras. Sound is ready. Let's have the camera team. Yes, this is for everyone, and that's mine. Vic Space TV, very good morning to you all. Vic Space TV, very good morning to you all. If you're watching, thank you, and if you're not, please feel free and join us. We're coming to you live from the Sheraton Kampala Hotel, where we are having the conference on the Constitution organized by the Center for Constitutional Governance. The conference will be starting soon. But in the meantime, we want to have a conversation reflecting on Uganda's constitutional journey over the decades. And I'm very pleased to be joined by this remarkable gentleman. From my immediate left is Dr. Robert Ojambo, Head of the History Department at Chambogo University. Good morning, Dr. Ojambo.
Good morning.
And next to Dr. Ojambo is Professor Mambusia Ndebesa, political historian. Professor, good morning and welcome to Civic Space TV.
Good morning. And
okay.
Good morning, and I'm happy to be before you and share issues of national importance.
Thank you, Professor. Next to Professor is Mr. Joseph Ocheno, political commentator and UPC ideologue. Joseph, good to have you.
Pleasure to be here. Thanks very much for having me. I'm delighted to be at the Kampala Sheraton, which was the Apollo Hotel, but many of the young guys here don't know, but no, I'm delighted to be here on this very important day.
Thank you, Joseph. Always a pleasure to have you. Last but not least is retired Major Awich Pola. Major Awich is the Director of External Relations of the NRM. Major, good morning and good to have you.
Morning and greetings to everybody. I'm happy to be here.
I know you're pressed by time and you have another engagement shortly. We shall hear from you and then we'll give you time to actually run and attend to other business. But let's start with you, Professor Mambusia. When you look at how far we have come, first of all, I would just like you to take us back to where we are coming from. Give us a historical perspective to set the pace for this conversation on the Constitution.
Thank you. I think I will start like this, that constitutionalism is not the same as a constitution. Having a constitution is just having the paper, but constitutionalism is about believing in the constitution and practicing the constitution. And I want to say that Uganda has had 4 constitutions since independence: the 1962 constitution, 1966, 1967, and 1999. And I want to begin by correcting an impression that has been given to the public, and it's a wrong historical fact. The Ugandans normally refer to the 1967 constitution as the pigeonhole constitution. It is not true. The pigeonhole constitution was the interim constitution of 1966, the one which members of parliament found in their pigeonholes in parliament and passed it within less than 4 hours. That's the pigeonhole, not the one of 67. The 67 one was discussed by parliament and they deliberated and passed it after about 1 month. So I wanted to make that correction. 2 is that we have had constitutions without constitutionalism. And it is unfortunate that Uganda, which is 62 years old, has had 4 constitutions when other countries that are 300, 400 years old have had only 1 constitution with a few amendments. Because we lack a spirit of constitutionalism, that is a belief and practice, that's why we have had these changes of the Constitution, because the Constitution is supposed to be a long-standing document, a mother law And this constitution is supposed to be embedded in principles and ideas and values, like the principle of separation of powers, the principle of human rights observance, the principle of equality, the principle of participation, the principle of rule of law. Now, when you have a constitution that is not written in the hearts of the people, but only written on the piece of paper, then that constitution cannot stand the test of time. And that is what we have experienced in Uganda. The historic experience we have had is that by the time we got independence in 1962, we got constitutions that were not embedded within the historic experiences of Uganda and Ugandans. If you take the example, when you take the example of UK, which is the oldest democratic state, their constitutional norms are embedded in their history. And by the way, they don't even have a written constitution, but they have a constitution in their hearts. If I can give some 4 examples, or 4 or 3 examples of the constitutional history of UK, some time back, about 800 years ago, in 1215, they had a struggle for liberty in UK. It was a struggle between some people called barons or some notables and their king. I think he was King John or somebody like that. So there was a struggle for separation of powers and liberties when they wrote a famous document called Magna Carta, or the Great Charter. In 1600s, I think 1668 or something like that, there was also a struggle between parliament and the executive and the king and the monarch. That is a struggle for separation of powers between the parliament and the executive. I think this is when actually UK nearly had a republic for 11 years actually. The members of parliament actually deposed the king, King Charles I, an army led by Cromwell, overthrew the king and brought his later somebody, I think King James or something, or somebody like that, under their terms. So the separation of powers began like that. And then in the 1880s, there was a Chartist movement. This was a movement of workers demanding for their workers' rights. So by now, the UK has an unwritten constitution, but a constitution in their hearts, because there was a struggle. Now in Uganda, quickly, you find that at independence, the people were not struggling for these principles of the constitution. The issues at hand were not separation of powers. The issues at hand were not the rule of law. The issues at hand were not observance of basic human fundamental rights. The issue was not equality per se. The issue was Buganda versus Uganda, Buganda versus Bunyoro, the Toro versus the Bakonzo. In Kapuchorwa, it was Bajisu versus the Sabinyi. In Ankweli, it was Beir versus Bahima. And the whole country, there was Catholics versus Protestants. It was not embedded in fundamental principles of the Constitution. And we have had changes of the Constitution. I have just told you how we have had 4, but even in between, there have been very many constitutional reviews. Idi Amin did not even pretend to rule with the Constitution. He just threw it away. He didn't even abrogate. Idi Amin simply banned the Constitution. Obote abrogated the Constitution in 1966. UNRF and the NRM, for them they had legal notices, legal notice number 1, and they changed the Constitution without even consulting the people. And now we have had a Constitution since 1995, which has been changed we don't know how many times. We don't know how many articles have been changed. So much so that we have now forgotten that the face of the 1995 Constitution. So briefly, that is the situation where we have a situation of having a constitution without constitutionalism, and having a constitution borrowed from outside, like we did in 1962, the Westminster Model of Constitutional Rule. It was like having new wine in old bottles. And now in 1995, we also had a liberal constitution, but the mindset of those who were supposed to govern, I think, was still not liberal. So we had a situation of having old bottles with new wine inside. So that is the situation of constitution and constitutionalism in Uganda.
Thank you very much, Professor Ndebeso. In the interest of time, I'll run straight to Major Awich. Major, your thoughts, first of all, in relation to what Professor was saying, but also generally speaking, what has this evolution for our Constitution been like? And perhaps what should our collective aspirations be as a country?
Well, thank you. First of all, I wanted to make a disclaimer. I had thought that I would run away for another program on UBC, but hearing the tone here and the subject matter, I would advise myself to stay till the end.
We would really appreciate you for that.
Because matters of constitutionalism is so important, and I think the other one can stay. Now, discussing the constitutional history of Uganda would ideally mean discussing the acts or the omission that shaped the body polity of Uganda. Ideally, one would want to run through what are the actions, the major milestones, or the major missions that shaped what is currently the Uganda that it is. And that would also answer my thoughts as you have asked. We don't need to tell ourselves again that when at one time we were here living as communities, and others were monarchy and others were not, like in the north. And in 1894, the British put us together in what they call the protectorate. The major milestone that I think I could share my thoughts on were that, as the professor says, the 1962 took us through. Before that, there were institutional framework, of course, where the arms of government attempted to be divided, the legislature, the executive, and all that. It was taking shape into what we now call Uganda. But the 62 independent constitution took us to 66, which UPC, my friend here, literally abrogated it, and Obote declared himself a president. It is worth noting because some people think that that is where the problem started. In that abrogation, the important aspect that was done was the declaration of Obote as president himself. Now, because we had a title head of state. But also, so that really was very fundamental, the political shaping of Uganda. But in 1967, which was discussed by Parliament, so to say, Parliament, in other words, constituted itself into a CEA. It is worth noting in our constitutional history that the Parliament of Uganda, instead of electing an independent constituent assembly to discuss the constitution, they constituted themselves into constituent assembly. And you would notice that in the 1995 constitution, there was Parliament, but instead a constitution statute number 5 of 1994 was passed as an act of Parliament, establishing a separate body to do the constitution. I hope we see the difference here. That instead of NRC, which was a parliament, saying we can actually make ourselves and make the constitution, they said, no, let's put a separate body. But in the Obote case, parliament turned itself into a constituent assembly and made the constitution. And the 67 constitution had also important milestone. First of all, it entrenched Obote again as a president for 5 years. And this was later, Amin raised it. Amin raised it, said, look, you abrogated the 66 constitution. The 67 one, you even declared yourself a president for another 5 years and extended the term of parliament. And these were acts which were taken not in good faith by Ugandans, and it caused problems. Now, so it went on until Amin took over, and we all know the effect in the shaping. Now, if you talk in constitutional terms, the Amin's time, it was decrease. Decrease means a president just wakes up and said, I have said Indians go, and or Asians for that case go. Decrease would mean you'll come up with a law to say miniskirt law. Women are not supposed to wear dresses beyond your knees, and that becomes a law. And several many others. So these were the decrees. You can now fit it in the constitutional nature of a country. That are you having a constitutional framework where you wake up and declare a law, or you would, in your constitutional mind, want an independent body that would discuss. Now, I now come to, of course, the NRM, the Legal Notice Number 1 of 1985, which also took a constitutional shape of 86, because Legal Notice Number 1 literally means the power of the state from today on is vested in NRM. That was the effect of Legal Notice Number 1. But can I mention something which is of a constitutional history that many Ugandans don't seem to know? Many Ugandans don't seem to know that after the fall of Amin, there were so many successive changes of government that Lule, for example, only lasted 68 days. Binaisa lasted for 6 months. Now, in the constitutional mind of Uganda, because we were discussing constitutional history, some Ugandans said, we put Lule so that we would organize election. Lule wanted to entrench himself. We put Binaisa. Binaisa was even worse in entrenchment. And surely I tend to use my words calculatively. Worse means you are comparing with others. Because in the case of Binaisa, he was saying by word of mouth that Entebbe a warmer. It was clear. For him, it was not hiding. It was more like Amin. He was saying Entebbe a warmer, that the chair is sweet. Now, the constitutional thinkers at that time said, colleagues, if everybody we put say Entebbe a warmer, what do we do? A constitutional development came up with Legal Notice Number 5 of 1980, which amended the Uganda Constitution by creating what was called a shared presidency. Colleagues, at any one time, Uganda was led by 3 people. Take, for example, you have President Museveni. Instead of President Museveni, you have President Nyamuchoncho, President Wachaulwol, President Musoke Saul. And all these guys were sworn here in Serena. They were sworn in Serena as head of state. And for the avoidance of doubt, if you want to know if somebody is a president, a law does not become a law until assented to by the president. These 3 people assented to so many laws in parliament. They assented to law. By then, the parliament was called the National Consultative Council. So, there was at any one time a constitutional amendment of Uganda where instead of having 1 president, you have 3. The 1980 independence celebration in Kololo, the three presidents went and read one speech. Like President Museveni goes to read a speech in Kololo, these three went and read jointly. So I thought as we talk of constitutional history, we need to mention this, because sometimes you see in charts, calendar charts, and they're putting heads of state, and they don't put these three. These three were presidents. Now, worth mentioning of constitutional path is what is under NRM. It is true that the parliament under NRM, instead of turning itself into a constitution making, it passed a statute which first put a commission to gather views, what you could call the Sempewa Commission. It collected views and views and views. And later on, in the views, it was resolved that a CA be an independent body, and it was discussed. I would like to conclude the CA by saying, even when this CA debated and passed the constitution, which was in essence, this 95 constitution was passed by consensus. It's a beautiful document. It was nearly a document passed by consensus, except land, federalism, national language, and something else. Only 4 things were in dispute in this constitution. Only 4 things. The rest of the issues in the constitution was by consensus. So ideally, we should be having now a constitution of the people, a constitution by the people. But of course, I'm sure my colleagues will raise debates there too, because there are schools of thoughts which think that it is not what it was. But that is for another day. But I just wanted to say the current constitution, save for the items, the 4 items that were in contention, the rest of the issues in that constitution were passed by consensus. Consensus means Ugandans generally agreed. I thank you.
Thank you very much, Major Paula. Let me hear from you, Dr. Roberto Jambo. I'm sure you'll also, I don't know if you will still pick up from where Professor Ndebesa stopped, or you'll have other perspectives that you would actually like to bring to the conversation.
Yeah, thank you so much, Judith. Indeed, I will start from where he stopped, but also give my own perspectives. He said that Uganda has had 4 constitutions. Indeed, it is true, but for me, I want to deal with why. Why has it been so? Our constitutions have been tailor-made. That is the biggest problem. All the 4 constitutions are tailor-made to the thinking of the leaders who are there. The 1962 constitution, the main purpose was to give Uganda independence. And the question was, how do you usher in independence to Uganda? And the biggest contention was, which Uganda are you talking about? There was Uganda, the outside of Buganda, and Buganda. Buganda wanted their own government, and the rest of the people, especially the British establishment, wanted the combined Uganda. And that's why even discussing the constitution would not take place here. They had to go to Lancaster. At the end of the day, we get a dual government constitution where we have federal government working with the central government. And that went on up to 1966. Then you come to the 1966 constitution, was to remove the Kabaka and the Buganda into the leadership of Uganda. And when you read that constitution very carefully, it does not sustain itself properly. And that's why immediately there is the 1967 constitution to introduce a Republican type of government in Uganda. And that's why it is called the Republican Constitution. The 1995 constitution was to usher in the NRM ideology into governance in Uganda. Because you remember from 1986 to 1995, we are under a system which is governed by the the NRC. And that NRC was continuing with the meetings that had been taking place in the bush in Luero, where things are discussed by generals and leaders of the revolution, and whatever is resolved there becomes the policy of the nation. And unfortunately, when you look at that constitution, yes, Major has said that it was discussed. Indeed, it is the longest. And here, I want to declare that for me, I am a student of constitutional history, so I follow these things very keenly. When you look at that constitution carefully, even if there were discussions, they were discussing a draft that had been written by a group of people, and ideas had been put together. So these Constituent Assembly members were discussing, guided on the drafts that had been put there. Now, the Constituent Assembly was doing its work, but there was another committee of 10, and these ones sat almost daily to determine what should be agreed, called commissioners. And these commissioners had to be briefed every day by the revolutionary leader, Yoweri Museveni. And therefore, what he did not agree could not see light. I have evidence. I've published this in my works, so you can go and read them. And I've talked to some of the people who were in these activities. But that is not the issue. The issue is because of the tailor-made that I've talked about, and as he said, the professor said at the beginning, we have never had a constitution that comes from the problems of the people. In other words, every time we come up with a constitution, we want to deal with somebody's interest or some group of people's interest. I'm confident that if today power fell off the NRM government, there will be the first process in this country will be a constitutional amendment. And therefore, people will want to write their own constitution. Now, when you look at that history, has created a constitution which, in most cases, is looked at as a constitution of this group of people. For example, the 1962 constitution, the other communities in Uganda thought that it was a constitution for UPC and Buganda establishment because they were the greatest beneficiaries from this constitution. The 1967 and 68, in most cases, that one, they look at them as the Obote constitutions or UPC. And unfortunately, this one also has been named as Museveni's constitution. And I can tell you why, and these people sometimes are right. When you look at this constitution, it emphasizes the biggest problem with our constitution of 1995 is that it emphasizes a lot presidentialism. There is a lot of presidentialism in the 1995 constitution to an extent that the constitution, when you look at it, more than 40 articles in the constitution are talking about the president. And I was not surprised when Major was speaking. He was also emphasizing presidency, and he talked about his 3 presidents. Those 3 presidents, Major, I can tell you that they were really figureheads. They didn't have anything. In fact, they were like, Uganda at that time was acting a movie or a comical thing. Those characters did not have any power because on top of them, there was a chairman of the military council, Paulo Muwanga, deputized by your own chairman, Yoweri Museveni. And those 2 were the ones taking decisions. Those names you are mentioning, that's why we cannot even put them on our chart. And I cannot accept because they did not have the power of a president, neither executive power, not even ceremonial power. I don't know what even they were doing there. So those presidents of yours, you can keep them there. Now, in 1995, when you look at the 1995 Constitution, it's a beautiful document. especially when you talk at our chapter 4. In fact, our best article in the Constitution, our chapter in the Constitution is article, chapter 4, which talks about human rights. That one is very good. But when you look at the others, there is a lot of presidentialism in them. And that's why in Uganda now, right now, the Constitution has given as if the country belongs to the president. Everything must be resolved by the president. He's the one who does almost all the most important appointments. To an extent that I'm fearing that very soon he will start appointing religious leaders. So that becomes a very big problem. And that's why you see everybody in Uganda knows that the only person who can solve a problem is the president. And therefore you have to struggle for the presidents and presidentialism.
Thank you.
The other big problem, as I finish, in all these constitutions, there was always somebody who was supposed to keep the constitution. And therefore that was supposed to be the army. And that's why you see in 1962, it is the army that, in 1971, it is the army which overthrows the constitution. In 1986, it is the army which overthrows the constitution. I just hope that the 1995 constitution will not be overthrown by the army.
Thank you.
But when you see
Robert, Doctor, I think we need to wind up. Let me hear from Mr. Ocheno.
Okay,
So, Joseph, you've heard what your colleagues have actually submitted, and I want to pick up from where Dr. Ojambo stops. The personalization or attaching individuals or personalities to the Constitution, like he's talked about, and basically what this portends for the strength and respect of the Constitution. What are your thoughts in this regard?
You know, I thank you, Judith. This is a fantastic day, actually. And I really hope that the events proceeding from here basically help to guide this country towards a long-term national independence, rule of law, constitutionalism, democracy, and genuine hope for young citizens of this country. I've got a friend whom I hope I will see later in the day. His name is Oscar Semwea. He is the popular voice in Capital Gang. It's not an advert, but the point is that he believes that I am not only the #1 optimist for UPC, but actually the #1 optimist for this country. The reason I deliberately invoke that is because I genuinely believe that from independence, there has been a genuine attempt to create a new nation. And for that, I suggest that I'm actually rather surprised that my colleagues would find major issues with the independence constitution. As a matter of fact, the 1962 constitution, notwithstanding all other challenges, was the most comprehensive in terms of citizen participation, except that there were no direct elections for assembly members. The Constitution Constitution Conference in London included all then existing political parties, all cultural institutions, meaning kingdoms at the time, and all identities across the country. Now, for Africans at the time who were not yet independent, under a British occupation over nearly 70 years, I do not see what better representation could have been than the guys who attended the Lancaster House Agreement that included part of the constitutional making process. But number two, in any case, the Constitution as a guiding document for a nation state at the heart of a nation did really do the best it could, except that that Constitution was tested immediately at independence when, in the wisdom of the massively democratically elected citizens of this country, in 1962 April elections, that in 1963 we have a constitutional amendment in which, and I realize that Ugandans don't have issues with that we seek radically to replace a British Governor General, that title, with an indigenous Ugandan. And so therefore, we abolish the office of Governor General, a British appointee, and we create an office of the President. Now that was done by Parliament, and I do not see anything wrong with that, an independent and an elected Parliament as such. Now, it is unfortunately the election of, the creation of office of the President, titular, that come 1966, the constitutional crisis that people localize it to UPC and Obote. Obote suggests that in 1965, the first attempt at shooting at the Constitution was an attempt by the then President, Sir Edward, plus others, to seek to overthrow the democratically elected government that included his. And that is basically what 1966 was. So in other words, the temporary interim constitution was basically an attempt to check whatever was being done unconstitutionally by the others and by a government democratically elected. It is recorded that apparently the then Attorney General Godfrey Binaisa, while Obote was seeking his advice in terms of the impasse that existed at the time, as far as the challenges of the Constitution was concerned, Obote says, how do I kill a baby that I was responsible for creating, as it were? And Binaisa reports, and I think this should be on record, that look here, you will not be killing it, you will simply be burying it. The President, meaning Sir Edward, had already killed it, meaning the President seeking to overthrow a constitution, a government for which he is President. That is the context. Thankfully, my decent colleagues have said that 1967 Republican Constitution, well thought of, well considered by legislators, debated, ending into a Republican Constitution. Why the Republican Constitution? Evidence had now suggested that it was going to be very difficult for an independent Ugandan government to work, democratically elected, to work side by side with a monarchy, in this case, unfortunately, Buganda, that did not see itself as being part and parcel of the new independent nation state, hence the 1967 Constitution. I argued, debated, and campaigned against the Constituent Assembly, CA, of NRA, which was a huge amount of waste of time. What CA was attempting to do, starting with the NRC in 1989, was basically an attempt by Mr. Museveni in a very motley but very deliberately chicanery way, seeking to legitimize their Bush establishment to get credibility as a new government. Remember, they had decided to rule by legal notice number 1. Now, who gave them the power to do that? Nobody talks about it. But anyway, my suggestion then was, and that was always the position of UPC, that as when the Okellos and the Musevenis came in 1985 to overthrow a democratically elected government, and Museveni defeating his colleagues, the Okellos, and then founding his own government in 1986, if there were any major constitutional issue, what he needed to do, they could have gone back to 1962 Constitution, because part of the argument at the time was that, well, 1966 and 1967 Republican Constitution was the source of the problem. They could have done so cheaply, they could have done so swiftly, and they really had no evidence of a battle with the 1966 Constitution. They did not. Why? In a way, that's why I agree with both Robert and indeed Professor Ndebesa, that really the 1995 NRA Constitution was a deliberate document designed for nothing else. Huge amount of public resources wasted, sometimes including donor money in the name of seeking constitutionalism, only to come with the 1995 Constitution. 1, a constituent assembly in which political parties were banned, a constituent assembly in which the 10 members of that assembly soldiers, and only 2 seats accorded to political parties. And people don't see anything wrong with that. So anyway, that was the context in which we then come with the 95 Constitution. But particularly, 1995 Constitution goes on to codify a legal notice number 1 Constitution under Article 269, banning political parties. And Ugandans clapped, and some friends of Ugandans clapped, and some donors actually clapped that Mr. Museveni and his group came in and created a constitution in which political parties are banned, meaning, for the first time in history, and I stand to be corrected, a constitution anywhere around the world is set and an assembly and a commission in which political parties are not involved. Governance is about politics. But at the same time, a constitution that comes in with an article banning political parties. But I think, like Professor and again Dr. Jambo have earlier said, there is no record anywhere of which group of Ugandans were consulted and said, those political parties are so bad, you must ban them and therefore codify Article 269. The conclusion is, it was a Mr. Museveni project and nothing else. But just to conclude on this, I think if you consider the number of amendments we've had under the NRA Constitution since 1995, and you consider the one challenge that the first independence government had, which was 1966, which really was resolved by the Republican provisions in 1966-67, I argue and I would suggest that constitutions really should have merely amendments. And just indeed, as Professor Ndebeza says, British Constitution unwritten. No, the guys who make the laws, who work on the constitutions, are freely democratically elected members of a National Assembly, meaning Parliament. They did so in 1962, 63. They did so in 1966 and 67. They could have done so without the 1995 Constitution. But unfortunately, because the 1995 Constitution is clearly a military NRA constitution in which political parties were not participant, whatever happens post where we are today could involve a constitutional amendment. Dr. Jambo suggests that maybe a post-Museveni regime would dump this constitution. I think it will depend on the quality of leaders we have post Mr. Museveni to determine whether or not we waste resources with the new constitution, or indeed, if there's an Ochieno president in future, one of the things that we could do would be perhaps to revisit 1962 Constitution as amended in 67, embed some of the decent things like Bill of Rights in terms of recent times, and basically govern to move forward. What is the most important thing? I think Ndebeza said it. It is possibly not about the frameworks of existing constitutions, but the leadership, the spirit, and the climate in which constitutional provisions are delivered. At the moment, regardless of whatever constitution we have, there is a national impunity. And so any conversation around constitutionalism is really nothing but a maintenance of business as usual.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Joseph. So let's do just one more round of your comments. But I would like in this round for each of you to address I want us to address this discussion now to the 1995 Constitution in particular, and the amendments that we have seen over its lifespan, which is 29 years now. And to what extent are these amendments actually healthy or regressive for our society? I understand the notion that the Constitution is a living document and therefore amendments are necessary, but at what point do you think we've actually gone off course, and how do we then correct course to actually make sure that the provisions of this Constitution are actually for a progressive society? I will start with you again, Professor Ndebeza, then I'll go back to you, Major.
Thank you for the question. You want to say that, again, to repeat, that a constitution is not the same thing as constitutionalism. That you can have the constitution on the paper, but without following it. So there has been a lot of constitutional hypocrisy in Uganda. The constitution has principles, as I mentioned earlier on, checks and balances, separation of powers, rule of law, respect of human rights, civilian control of the military, etc., etc. But you find they are not practiced. They are not believed, first of all, and therefore they are not practiced. And so you find a document is somewhere, somehow hanging, and people do not believe in it, and the leadership do not believe in it, because I think, to use Mamdan's expression, because in Uganda we don't have citizens, we have subjects. We are yet to have citizens. The citizens that will hold the constitution, the leaders accountable. We don't have national solidarity. We still are thinking in terms of tribes, in terms of ethnic communities, in terms of regions. That's why just last week I think an MP misbehaved in parliament and beat somebody, and when he went home he was welcomed as a hero. That's why I think the speaker and an MP went to Rwengo, or was it what district, and said, if you steal national resources and come and give the crumbs to the people, you are in order. And people cheered the politicians. That's why when somebody is arrested, when involved in a corruption scandal, the people, including the bishops, come to plead for the person that he or she should be released. That is an indicator that there is no nationhood, and therefore there is no guarantee of constitutionalism if the people do not believe in it and the leaders do not believe in it, and there is a lot of hypocrisy around. Finally, to touch on your question, there have been very many amendments to the 1995 Constitution. I don't know how many, I think there are more than 100 amendments. By the way, by default, I participated in the 1995 Constitution making as a researcher, not as a CA delegate. And somehow I have the background to this Constitution and the constitutional provisions. I will touch on a few to show the constitutional hypocrisy that we have, and therefore it cannot work, because the Constitution must be written in the hearts of the people before you practice what is written on the piece of paper. Some of the amendments, or one of the amendments was, for example, shifting from a movement system to multi-party system. And it was through even a referendum or something like that. And later, the president, who has presided over this new constitution since it was promulgated, he did say that, incidentally, the movement is superior to multi-party. What exercise we have been undergoing is kubejako, just getting rid of some people as we move forward. That is constitutional hypocrisy. If you don't practice what is in the Constitution, then that is hypocrisy. Citizens themselves do not know their obligations to the state. That's why they cheer people who have said you can steal public funds and still be cheered. So that is why we need to look at a constitution beyond the paper, beyond the theories, and see whether we have national norms, national values, national ideals that we share in common, that we believe in, and then we put on a piece of paper so that these norms, these standards, these principles guide our behavior, our political behavior, our social behavior, so that we craft a state, an order of the state, a state order that is embedded, that is infused, that is guided by certain principles that we believe in, not just that we put there as mere statements for hypocritical purposes. Otherwise, that is why I said that these constitutions that we have just borrowed and written on paper without believing in is like having new wine in old bottles, or having old bottles inside there is a new wine, where you have a nice document with principles like separation of powers, when actually there is no separation of powers. Like now, everybody knows that our parliament is under executive control. Everybody knows that the army, the military is not under civilian control. But we continue to say we have a constitution. And so, moderator, we don't know even how many amendments have been made in this constitution. The other time, I nearly made myself into a fool. I didn't even know that another DC, the provision for another DC had been amended. You see, what was put in the Constitution in 1995 was that the RDC is supposed to be a senior civil servant. And the senior civil servant is clearly defined in the standing orders of public service in Uganda. I don't know when it was amended that now anybody can be an RDC. So, unless and until Uganda is a nation state with national solidarity, with national cohesion, these documents, we shall continue writing them and claiming we have constitutions when we don't have constitutionalism. That is to say, we do not have the norms, the values, the belief in what we have written down that guides how the society is organized, how the state is organized, how the citizens and the state relate without resort to use of force, so that it is legitimate in the hearts of the people. Can we translate what we say, what we write, from the head to the heart? There are those who think that we do not have constitutionalism or practice because people are not aware, people are ignorant. No. You will find somebody with a master's and PhD in human rights violating human rights. You will find very many people who can read English and therefore can read the Uganda Constitution of 1995. They are the ones who actually abrogate it, or they are the ones who actually violate it. So it's not a question of knowing, cognition. It is a question of the normative framework. We have a legal framework as a constitution, but we lack the normative framework as a constitution in the hearts of citizens. But because, after all, they are not citizens, they are subjects.
Thank you. Thanks a lot, Professor. I'll go to you, Major. Oh, yes. If you would actually respond to what he's saying, but also the question I had posed earlier. When you look at the amendments that have accompanied the 1995 Constitution over the last 29 years or so, and whether or not, to what extent these amendments are actually progressive for us as a country.
Thank you so much. I will answer that. But in a second or so, I want to comment about what my colleagues had said. Professor Diambo seemed to have queried the relevancy of the shared presidency. I simply said this because I say, if you are discussing the constitutional path of Uganda, are you deciding to isolate or ignore others? These were real occurrences, and they happen. You can't sweep them away. These were titular heads of state. Just like Kabaka Mutesa was when Obote was the prime minister. Are you saying because Obote was the executive prime minister and Kabaka was there, so rub it off from the book of history? No. But even in its essence, the amendment to create a shared presidency under the Constitution was to kill a mischief of repeated change of governments That was the mischief being cured. Lule after 68 days, Binaisa after this. So the intention of amending the constitution to create 3 people in one to be the president of Uganda was to cure that mischief, and it did. And that is why Uganda afforded to have the 1980 election. Without this creation of a shared presidency, there would have been change of government after 1 week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks. You can see that by amending to make 3 people, it made people lose appetite in presidency. It didn't become sweet again. Because if you are 3 and it kuomera 1, the other 2 will not kuomera. So I do not see how the professor want to wash this. In any case, they ascended to laws. Laws are there. 2, they have powers or prerogatives. They forgave people who were convicted in Luzira. These were real powers of a head of state. They did their part. The other thing I want to comment about is, why is it that Parliament is not the best fitted person to make a constitution? There are many reasons. Parliament is conflicted. And that is why in the 1967 constitution, because of conflict of interest, the same parliament that made the constitution gave themselves 5 years. And that is why the thinking in NRM was, don't make parliament make the constitution because they have conflict of interest. Suppose they make the constitution and award themselves 20 years. So make a separate body do it. And that is why NRC did it. Worth noting here is that there is the debate on the movement and the multi-party or pluralism. I think this came up in our constitutional history because there was a school of thought which thought that we could have our indigenous democracy. To this effect, 2 referendums were held. One was held and was cancelled by court of law. That one, it was held that people had chosen the movement system. But the other one which took place and was finally taken up was that a referendum was held and Ugandans chose that we should have a plural system. But remember, in the constitution, 2 systems are in place. A multi-party system and a movement system. But the constitution provides that when one is in place, the other is in abeyance. Let me go to the amendment. Moderator, you had started off by saying a constitution is a living document. A constitution is not cast on rocks. It is not written on stones. And constitution well over is amended. As I said earlier, the purpose of passing a law, including the constitution, is to address a mischief. And in our Ugandan constitution, the mischief is elaborated in the preamble. But when you pass this document, it appears so good. But when you set it into motion, you start seeing cracks, you start seeing challenges, and that is what warrants the constitution. And indeed, ours has been amended. Remember, I had said that this constitution, apart from federalism, apart from political system, apart from land and the national language, the entire constitution was a consensus. So for those who said it was an NRM constitution, how comes each and every provision was passed by consensus except federalism, political system, national language, and land? So what a contradiction that the Constitution of 95 was an NRM constitution, and yet it had varied members where everything else was passed by consensus. Now, it is worth mentioning what would, after all the amendments, what would a good constitution do? How would it look like? A good constitution with the amendments should show what it shows now. It should generate debate. And here we are debating. And we continue to debate across the country, on radios, on everywhere, on TVs. A good constitution should provide peace. There's no doubt that in Uganda, we have peace in all corners of the country. All corners of Uganda, there's peace. Now, you can't take it for granted, but don't take it for granted. There wouldn't be that peace if we didn't have a good constitution. A good constitution should provide production in terms of goods and services, because the constitution is not hanging in the air. And once there's production in the country, then you judge that you have a good constitution. A good constitution should make our livelihood good. We keep assessing the life expectancy of Ugandans. There was a time, there was even a study done in East Africa, that the countries of East Africa, Uganda was the happiest. I don't know what survey it was, whoever did it. That in happinessometer or happinessagram, we were the happiest. So a constitution is not a document in place just for the sake. A constitution should be reflected in the livelihood of the people. Sometimes we think that when a constitution generates debate, then the constitution is getting opposition. No, by its nature, that constitution should be a document that makes people talk, a document that makes people discuss, but a document that makes us discuss and walk away peacefully. So that is the essence of the amendment. Several of them, and this may not be the end. You could even find that what we have amended today would be brought back tomorrow. Who knows? Amendment is to address a mischief, and mischief do arise by time. I thank you.
Thank you very much, Major Witch. Can I hear from Joseph first? Then I come back to you, Dr. Ojambo. Still in relation to the constitutional amendments that we've seen over the years. But also, if you could touch a little bit on what Professor Ndebesa has actually talked about, the constitutional hypocrisy that actually we witness over time. And basically, how do we actually correct this?
I think, as I said at the beginning, really, regardless of the constitutions that we may have, it is very much about the leadership, the spirit, the context, and the circumstances under which these constitutions are drawn up and come up by. As I said, the Independence Constitution of 1962, I still want to insist, was a national consensus document that represented all broad spray of citizenry across the country, different, as I said, all political parties, all cultural institutions, including kingdoms, and all Republican identities across the country, granted with their duly elected representatives at the time, simply because it did not deliver for certain specific interests. It does not therefore mean that they're not inapplicable. In any case, therefore, an argument that had been suggested that the 1962 Constitution benefited Buganda and UPC is actually erroneous. It simply happens to be that UPC won the independence elections convincingly. Buganda came third. DP, that was the second political party, when UPC asked for a government of national unity, which was very generous of UPC at the time, and of course will be generous of UPC in future. DP refused to join that government of national unity, really not because of UPC, but because of DP's own historical differences with Mengo as a kingdom. Now, that constitution, you would argue, the beneficiaries were critically Bunyoro, because it provided for a referendum on lost counties, fantastic arrangement that people don't talk about. Of course, the referendum did take place. The will of the people prevailed. Buganda didn't like it. I think it's a conversation that we need to be able to have going forward. But I believe that whatever, what was the question again?
The amendments.
Yeah, further amendments, yes, indeed. Yeah. Yes. So as I said, 1963 Constitution Amendment was very specific. In my opinion, it was democratizing and giving ownership to the citizens of Uganda, meaning deleting, removing a British appointee of the Queen as our symbolic leader and creating an office of the president elected by parliament. This is what happens in India. This is what happens in Germany. This is what happens in Italy. This is what happens in Israel. This is what happens in Ireland, except recently Ireland now have directly elected president, but still a symbolic president. I think so these were by and large fantastic. The 1966 constitution was a response, if you like, to a national constitutional crisis, as it has been said, and it was actually interim. 1967 constitution sort of, if you like, replaced that. But fast forward, as I said, 1995 NRA constitution. Was it necessary? It has been. This is already where we are. Was it necessary? By and large, I said it was a huge waste of public resources. I'll repeat, it was a chicanery designed to legitimize a military dictatorship that had taken over political power unconstitutionally and banned political parties. But granted, they came. So since 1995, why all the major constitutional amendments, and particularly if we praise this document that it was a people-centered document in which we had a constituent assembly that deliberated over years, taking huge amount of our monies and sometimes begged some of the monies. Why the amendments? I'm telling you, Judith, all these things it will happen in as long as I think Dr. Jambo and Professor were saying, when there is no goodwill, when people in politics want to use legal and constitutional documents to push a specific agenda, we should refer to those individuals. But back to the question of constitutionalism, I am surprised that sometimes the current constitution still provides for that thing, so-called movement political system, that the rest of the world have got no clue. Basically, it's a closet dictatorship. And maybe one of the things that my good brother Norbert Mao working on the constitution amendment, I hope that should we have that arrangement, we should delete this idea that there's something called a movement political system, because it does not exist around the world. It was designed then, it served them. Part of my concern is that what really we're discussing today, or experiencing today, is a continuation of a closet movement political system, meaning basically a closet dictatorship in fine suits, except that they put on slightly much more yellow than my fantastic red.
Thank you, thank you very much, Joseph. We have about, I think, 10 minutes precisely for us to actually conclude. Dr. Ojambo, your thoughts. I think you'll be the last person to actually comment, and then I'll get concluding remarks from each one of you. If your mic is not working, you could actually use mine.
Yeah, Judith, thank you. I would like to invite the audience that when you are discussing about constitutionalism, and then maybe you go to a constitution, there are three things you must bear in mind. Number one, you must be honest. Number two, you must be national. Should think about the nation more than the individuals. And number three, you must be truthful. When you look at the 1995 Constitution, and I have looked at this Constitution very carefully, and out of that, I have written a book chapter entitled The 1995 Constitution as a Tool for Dictatorship in Uganda, a Dilemma for Constitutionalism in Africa. I would like to invite you to read that work and critique it so that you can understand what Judith is asking me to do in the next few minutes. When you look at that Constitution, 1995, at the beginning there was a lot of euphoria and hope. In fact, when it was passed, somebody termed it as a fulfilled hope. But with the time, it has not been the hope. And if you want to understand the 1995 Constitution, don't ask these elite and people who have sat at the law school or any place. Just go to a local person in any of this part of the country and interrogate them whether they even understand whether it exists, and if it does, how does it help them to survive in their daily life. When you look at that Constitution, and why I call it a tool for dictatorship, it is used to promote what I call rule by law. but not rule of law. Whenever an article does not favor a group of people, or does not favor the president, or the party, or anybody who has power in this country, an amendment becomes imminent. And you have seen, if you look at from the time we started amending, in fact, I talked about the process of making the Constitution in my first remarks. Now, when you go to the second level, where we started amending it, just see why the Constitution have been amended. The Constitution is amended normally more than 80% to benefit the president. In most cases, when an article is obstructing the president in anything, it will be amended, and he will make sure that it is amended. Or when a group of people who are very dear to the president complain about something, it is amended. And you will look at all the amendments have not been through consensus, as my good major was saying. These amendments have been patronized by the gun. There must be soldiers on this street to make sure that an amendment is done. Look at the good amendments, 10 of them, that have happened in this 1995 Constitution. I'll begin with the 2005 amendment, leaving others for emphasis. And one of the things that this brought was to introduce multi-party system in government. At that time, I was a very good adult, a graduate of Makerere University, so I understood whatever was happening. And I was shocked. I was really shocked what the president said. The president, in fact, did not believe in the amendment. He walked around campaigning by saying, let's allow these bad-mannered people to go and present their manners elsewhere. So it was not an amendment which was trying to better the lives of the people, but it was to help the sitting government to get rid of people who were not agreeing with them, so that they can go and practice their multi-party, but which will never be allowed to be practiced. You remember Article 265, was it 269? The article of 269. Article 269 had been a very big problem in this country, and I have seen Leander Komakech there when we were students, used to come and mobilize us against that article under the Uganda Young Democrats. Now, that article was not only something, in fact, I look at Ugandans sometimes and shudder. How could they allow such an article in the Constitution where you have a full chapter on human rights, that you can have an article that does not allow people to associate in the same Constitution? And that was removed later. And many other amendments. So I would like just to invite you to read that book chapter that I have authored, and it will answer the question that Judith is asking. In my view, I still believe the 1995 Constitution is a tool for dictatorship in Uganda.
Thank you very much for your thoughts, gentlemen. Let me now just have your concluding remarks. It is just 4 minutes to 9:30, and we need to actually get this conference moving. Should I start with you, Major? Let me start with Professor Ndebesa, your concluding remarks. I mean, it's been an interesting conversation. We would actually still probably go on for another 2 hours or so, but in the interest of time, we actually have to cut this short.
Just 1 minute. I just want to invite the audience to look at this question and try to look for answers for it. Why have the constitutions in Uganda failed to stand the test of time? Can I repeat it in case you didn't get it? Why have the constitutions in Uganda failed to stand the test of time? My considered answer here in summary is that one, our leaders have practiced constitutional hypocrisy. And the led, who are not citizens but subjects, have exercised their restraint through political apathy. I rest my case.
Thank you, Professor. Major Witch.
This is a wrap-up. I'm not opening a new debate.
No. You're concluding in the interest of time.
Yeah, Professor likes to do it. I came here to give my thoughts on the constitutional history of Uganda. And I like to say that this entity called Uganda, from 1894, since it was declared a British protectorate, has gone through ups and downs and has had several landmarks, some omissions, some commissions, which has shaped our constitutional status now. They could have happened for a reason or an accident, but here we are. Only that a true constitution is tested by time. We were lucky, or we are still lucky, that the current constitution is hitting 3 decades. And by Ugandan standard, that is a long enough. And that could mean that possibly it is a good piece of document. But an amendment is an amendment to cure a mischief. If a mischief is detected, it must be addressed. If not, the country would go into anarchy, since this is the grand norm. Therefore, the fact that this current constitution has had its longest stay of 3 decades and still going, possibly things we should thank the brains, the lawmakers, those who put the draftsmen and women of the Constituent Assembly that gave birth to this document. Let's watch and see how far it takes us, but the test is in the peace and the security of the country.
Thank you very much. I do appreciate your comments, Major. Let's hear from you, Joseph, your concluding remarks.
A good constitution should be really a document, terms of reference, that ensures the rule of law. And that where there is a rule of law, those rules should be enforced. Since the promulgation of the NRA 1995 Constitution, that is now left to the jury. Quite clearly, it's absent. But in any case, we know that a good constitution is based on really primarily the spirit, the will, and culture of a nation state. The 1962 Constitution provided for that. It got challenged in 63, 64, then critically 66, that emerged with the 1967 Constitution. I do not see anything that was fundamentally wrong with that. I argued and still do that possibly all we needed to do was to have a 1967 Constitution as amended, or if we deleted it, we could go back to 62. But really, remember, we're now a Republican state. We are a republic, and nobody contests that. Anything else that has happened has been a waste of time. Whatever we have at the moment is a continuation of justification and entrenchment of dictatorship, and we are at, if you like, an impasse. Anything that we can do going forward really is a review of this, and that's why it's an important conversation. But I hope out of this there will be a leadership that emerges that seeks to guarantee a rule of law and stability for our country. But that cannot really be simply because an existing political establishment has not been overthrown or disorganized, means therefore we have a constitution that works and functions, when we know in reality there's a constitutional impunity, which I hope part of this conversation will ensure that it comes to an end, and it comes to an end rather soon.
Thank you very much, Joseph. Dr. Ojambo, we'll hear from you last, and then we'll close this session of the conversation.
Thank you so much, Judith. And Major, today I'm going to give you the shortest conclusions I've ever made. A constitution is nothing without constitutionalism in Uganda. We have a constitution, but there is very little constitutionalism. Thank you.
Thank you very much to all of you. Ladies and gentlemen, this has been our political panel discussion on Uganda's constitutional journey over the decades. I would like to really thank each one of you. Dr. Robert Ajambo, who is the head of the History Department at Kyambogo University. Thank you, Doctor. Thank you very much, Professor Mwambutsi Ndebesa, political historian at Makerere University. And also to you, Mr. Joseph Ocheno, political commentator and UPC ideologue. Special thanks to you. Last but not least, retired Major Wich Paula, who is the Director for External Relations at the NRM. Thank you very much, Major. Thank you for making time and for your insights. This has been quite an illuminating, insightful conversation. I wish we could have actually had a longer conversation. If you joined us late, you can always go back and watch. This discussion has been streaming live on Civic Space TV on YouTube. You can actually follow the conversation at your convenient time. I would now request my wonderful panelists to please go and take your seats as we actually officially start the conference. Thank you very much.